Greetings to each and every one of you. We don't serve colored people here. Did you say you wanted to buy Pear's soap? It's very expensive, you know. You may be black on the outside, but you're really, really white on the inside. You know, if you kept quiet and didn't say a word, you could pass for an Indian, a South Indian. Nigger. Do any of these words sound familiar to you? Have any of you had any of these words directed at you? Do you remember how you felt? Angry, perhaps? Well, I've had every single one of these directed at me during the course of my life. I've been told who I am, where I could be, what I could do, and most amusingly of all, as if almost magically I could be transformed from who I am to somebody who is more acceptable to the speaker. Do you think that's right? Well, I was born in the Bechuanaland Protectorate, which is present-day Republic of Botswana. And when I was a few months old, the family moved to England. We returned home when I was about 5 years of age. And when I came home, I was treated like an outsider by the other children because I did not sound like they did. For my university education, I went to South Africa at the height of apartheid. And I was treated like an outsider there by fellow black students because I did not sound like they did. For my postgraduate studies, I went to England and I went to India. And in England, I was treated like an outsider because according to an Englishman, even though I was an African, I sounded as though I was on Radio 3. And in India, I was treated like an outsider because I was an African vegetarian. In fact, somebody once said to me, "Tell me, is it true that the fingers are the tastiest part of the human body?" To which I responded, "I wouldn't know, I'm a vegetarian." So upon my return home to begin my professional life, I was treated as an outsider by some because my father had a long, long time ago been a senior civil servant. And so you see, for most of my life, I've experienced being treated like an outsider. These experiences really got me thinking about who I am. These experiences got me thinking about self-awareness. They got me thinking about awareness of others and the link between those two spaces of awareness. And so today, I'd like to share with you my 3 keys to self-leadership. You may ask, why self-leadership? Well, because in my over 23 years of working with the poor, yes, the poor, that group of people who often struggle to catch the proverbial last train leaving the station, we all know about. The poor, that group of people, who are often blamed for holding back progress because they need assistance. In my over 23 years of working with the poor, I've come to ask the question, why? Why do we make such unconscious choices? Why do we live with such unconscious complacency? And why, thirdly, do we accept unconscious conformity, which appears to have now become a new normality? I had a chat with a lawyer recently who works for the government, and one of her jobs was to ensure that anybody who takes the life of another intentionally and unlawfully is intentionally and lawfully put to death. And you know in Botswana, this is done by hanging. She also told me she had no choice but to do her job. I, of course, challenged her personal choice-making. I pointed out to her that she had chosen to study law, she'd chosen to work for the government, and she'd chosen to uphold a law which states that whoever intentionally and unlawfully takes the life of another will intentionally and lawfully be put to death, unless, of course, there are extenuating circumstances to explain the crime. She could not now try and hide behind her choices, consciously or unconsciously. She then told me that she'd recently been experiencing discomfort. Discomfort so great that she'd requested an interdepartmental transfer. So why the discomfort? Because she'd come to realize the consequence of her choices on the lives of others. Of course, I congratulated her heartily because I thought, great. Why did I congratulate her heartily? Because I love discomfort. Discomfort can force thinking, as opposed to comfort, which easily leads to complacency. The organization for which I work, Ditswanelo, the Botswana Centre for Human Rights, brought an urgent action before the court in 1999. And the purpose of that action was to prevent the impending execution of 2 indigenous men. They'd been found guilty of murder. They had 24 hours left to live, and their graves had already been dug. In Botswana, the bodies of the executed are buried on the prison grounds, and the families do not attend the burial. However, in the case of these 2 men, they were eventually released after a 10-year stay in prison. They were released by Justice Guduwalia, who had concerns about the fairness of their trial. However, long before that decision by the judge, I decided that it was really important for me to meet the family of the murder victim. This was much against the wise counsel from my own family and my colleagues in the office. What were they concerned about? They were worried about my safety. Nevertheless, I found myself sitting in a room filled with relatives of the deceased. Relatives racked by deep pain and sadness at the loss of their loved one, but also filled with deep rage. At one point during the conversation, a young relative lifted her arm and pointed at me and said, "Seeing as you have not allowed the heads of those 2 men replace the head of our uncle, yours is going to go in its place." To which I said, yes. This is what I call the sacrificial lamb discourse. A relationship which began with such hostility did, however, develop into one of mutual respect, symbolized by the exchange of gifts of fruit. I received sweetreed, and I gave an apple. And so that was one of the experiences which I had in living life consciously, conformist or not. We are sent to school to get an education, to hopefully get a job, to be able to make money, and to have choices in our lives. And I chose to study law. Everyone, including my parents, probably thought that one day I would become a normal lawyer doing a normal lawyer's job. And I think secretly everybody also thought I'd make a lot of money. However, sitting in law class one day in apartheid South Africa, Professor Dennis Davis effectively told me that equality before the law was a myth. He made reference to somebody called Anatole France, who had a long, long time ago said, all, both rich and poor, are forbidden from sleeping under the bridges on the banks of the River Seine in Paris, from stealing bread, and from begging in the streets. Clearly, only the poor ran the risk of falling foul of such a law. And so this planted a seed in me a long time ago, which eventually developed into my lifelong commitment to working to ensure that as many people as possible experience true equality before the law and access to justice. I made a choice to not making money. So this daily reality is faced by my life partner and father of our 3 children every single day. And he copes by repeating his mantra, which has been personally affirmed for him by none other than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And it goes something like, I can cope with this. I know you are living your calling. I can cope with it. You're living your calling. And so another experience of making choices, living life consciously, conformist or not. But so how does one begin on this journey? The first thing is to get to know that person who knows you better than anybody else, yourself. So the first key to self-leadership is know yourself. When I was a student in apartheid South Africa, I joined a radical feminist group called Rape Crisis. And one of the core areas of our work was to provide support to survivors of violence. And in those days, we talked about violence against women, and now we talk about gender-based violence. Now, for a lot of these women, they were in relationships so abusive that they were abused by husbands and partners and beaten up so badly that they often needed urgent medical attention. Working with them got me thinking about relationships, about intimate relationships, about marriage, and also about wedding rings. Now, those of you who are married probably have your wedding ring on the fourth finger of your left hand. I have mine on the fourth finger of my right hand. And you may ask why. Because I chose to have it there. You may ask why. Because I'm right-handed. I also chose not to trade in my name. So having got to know myself, I realized I needed to name myself. The second of my 3 keys to self-leadership. I name myself a woman, a partner, a mother, a daughter, a sister who speaks Setswana, English, a bit of French, even less Dutch, and a smattering of Afrikaans. But most importantly, I name myself a Botswana, whose identity is deeply rooted in our value concept of Botho. Botho, which recognizes that my humanity is linked to the humanity of each and every person in this world. Botho, which recognizes that every single person has a right to be treated with dignity. What is most important to me is that how I see myself in the world should form the basis of how I see others in the world. I was standing in the bathroom of an apartheid-era department store while I was a student in apartheid South Africa when an elderly white woman peered at me. And she said, "Are you a boy or a girl? The boys' toilets are down the corridor." So you see, not only has my color been called into question, I'm really white. You're imagining I'm black. And I'm not really a Motswana, I'm actually an Indian. So my gender identity was also called into question. Of course, I named myself. I was a girl, very aware that I was standing in a white-dominated bathroom in apartheid South Africa, faced by a well-meaning but thoroughly misguided elderly white woman for whom probably all blacks looked the same. But also, interestingly, in my professional life, I went on to seed other organizations and to work very closely with those working directly on the issue of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, that is a group of people who definitely know themselves and are increasingly naming themselves around the world. So I name myself a child, a person with disabilities, a refugee, an asylum seeker, dare I say a migrant, an indigenous person, and a composite sexual-oriented and gender-identified person. So having got to know myself, name myself, I realized I needed to be myself in the world. That is the third of my 3 keys to self-leadership. Thinking about it, I realized I'd been beaten to this a long time ago. Somebody had once said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And that was Mahatma Gandhi. Now, leadership is not only about leading others, it is about leading self with purpose towards a goal. How you lead should reflect the values of the goal which you seek. Botswana turned 50 years old in 2016, after 85 years of having been a British protectorate. Some of you may have seen the film A United Kingdom. It is about the relationship between our first president, at the time he was traditional leader of his people, and his future wife, who at the time was an English woman. And we know that their interracial marriage in the 1940s caused huge outrage around the world. It was deeply opposed to by then neighboring apartheid South Africa and by the then British government. While I was at university in apartheid, apartheid South Africa, at the University of Cape Town, I was elected onto the residence committee responsible, my portfolio, culture. I was the only black student in the residence. I was responsible for culture. So, using that portfolio, I decided to invite Lady Kama, as she then became known, to be our guest speaker. Her acceptance of my invitation was deeply symbolic for me. She deeply abhorred racism, as do I. And I wonder what she'd make of this last story, which I'd like to share with you. Some months ago, I was on the train in Vienna, Austria, and I made way for a young man walking in my direction. As he walked by, he muttered. He muttered loudly enough for me to hear, but softly enough for nobody else to hear. He muttered the word nigger. Now, I don't speak Austrian German, but I understand the word nigger in any language. So, what did I do? I did not acknowledge his insult. I did not give him power to name me. I ignored him. Now, he probably went away thinking, why did I come across the most ignorant nigger on the train who hadn't even realized she'd been insulted? So you may ask yourself, why did I react that way? Because I knew myself. I had named myself, and I had taken my place on that train. What would you have done? Thank you.